Welcome to episode 23 of Real Health Radio. Any links or resources mentioned in this show can be found at 7health.com/23. So that's www.seven-health.com/23.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. Health advice that's more than just about how you look. And here's your host, Chris Sandel.
Hey everybody, it's Chris Sandel here and welcome to another episode of Real Health Radio. So the show's had a 2-week hiatus. I went out to Australia in mid-December and was out there for just shy of 4 weeks. I put together a number of shows before hanging out there, and they were the episodes that you heard throughout December. I had planned to put together more before heading out, but I actually had a rather crappy end to the end of 2015, end of last year, which I mentioned on the blog this week. My girlfriend was 8 weeks pregnant, which we were really excited about, but it turned out to be an ectopic pregnancy, and this is unfortunately something we only discovered once her fallopian tube had erupted and I had to rush her to hospital for emergency surgery. It was all really horrible, and I spent a lot of the last year dealing with all this before flying out to Australia. So I had good intentions to do lots of podcasts and do everything in advance, but as so often happens in life, it didn't go as planned, and I was spending my time doing other things. I'd also hoped to record some stuff while I was out in Australia, but it also just didn't happen. I was seeing clients while I was out there and dealing with that side of things. But I needed a holiday. It had been, as I said, a really tough end to the year. And so I just made the decision to have a couple of non-podcast weeks. So personally, I think it was for the best, and I'm now back and feeling refreshed and have lots of things lined up. But just in case you were wondering why there hadn't been any shows for the last 2 weeks, now you know. So the last thing I want to mention just before we get started with the show this week is I'm just opening up my practice again to new clients. So I take on clients twice a year, once at the start of the year and once at the midpoint through the year. I work with clients for a period of 5 months, and we have a consult for an hour every 2 weeks. I have clients all over the world, and I do the consults via Skype. So if you're not based in the UK, this isn't a problem. More than half the people I work with are based outside the UK, whether that be Australia or Canada or the US or other parts of Europe. So before I work with anyone, I like to have a free initial chat with them, and it allows me to find out more about what they're wanting help with and what they're wanting to get out of us working together. And it also then gives me the opportunity to explain how I work with clients and how that process works. So basically that free initial chat is us seeing if we're a right fit for one another. And I only want to work with people I truly believe that I can help and people who are really on the same page. And so this chat allows us to determine that. So if you are interested in finding out more, I recommend heading over to 7health.com/help. So that's www.seven-health.com/help, and it will redirect to the page that talks about how I work with clients. If you'll then have a read through that, if you're then interested, then click on the link where you can arrange to have a free chat with myself, and I'll get in contact with you within the next 48 hours and we can arrange a time. So if you are wanting to start 2016 with some help about your health or your nutrition or body image or food issues, then head over to 7-health.com/help and get in contact with me. So with all that out of the way, let's start today's show. It's another one where it's just me discussing a topic on my own, and today's topic is thyroid issues. I sent a survey out at the end of last year asking people what they wanted me to cover in blog posts and on the podcast, and thyroid was one of the things that came up the most. And so it's a really common thing I see with clients coming to me and with people dealing with and struggling with. So I wanted to cover it in the show. And just to say up front, thyroid issues or thyroid is a really huge topic. And there's only so many different aspects to it that I want to cover as part of today's show, just so I keep it at not crazy long. And I want to go over the stuff that I think is most relevant to the kinds of people that I'm normally seeing. And I'm already thinking that I'll probably do a second show covering some more topics to do with thyroid issues. But for now, I'm starting with what I think are the most important bits. So to begin with, the real basics, the thyroid gland sits in the neck and is part of your endocrine system or your hormonal system. And it produces and releases hormones, and these hormones have a direct impact on your metabolic rate. They actually impact on how your cells work. So things like how your cells produce energy and how your cells produce hormones. So they have, or your thyroid has, a real body-wide effect. And to give you an indication of how important the thyroid is, let me just list some of the functions that it impacts on within the body. So fat and carbohydrate metabolism, blood cholesterol and triglycerides, so blood fats, blood flow, your heart rate, your rate and depth of respiration, your digestive juice secretion, transit time of food, your speed of thinking, your immune function, your steroid hormone creation. And this list isn't exhaustive by any means, but basically the thyroid has an impact on nearly every organ and every system within the body because it directly impacts on pretty much every cell. So with thyroid conditions, as with other conditions within the body, some are described as hyper and some are described as hypo. And hyperthyroidism means hyper means high. So it means that there is an overactive thyroid issue. So your thyroid is producing too much of the hormones. And with hypo means low. So hypothyroidism means that the thyroid is underactive. It's not producing enough of the hormones for your body to function correctly. So with these symptoms associated with hypothyroidism, I'm going to go through both of them. With both of them, there are really long lists of symptoms. And so definitely the same with hypothyroidism. It could be a really long list, and I'm just going to cover the major ones. And as an example, there's a book by Mark Starr called Hypothyroidism Type 2, where he dedicates, I think it's 86 pages to describing the symptoms of hypothyroidism. So there's obviously a lot that I could cover as part of this. Side note, it's a really good book. I would highly recommend checking it out if you're interested in this stuff. But some of the more common symptoms with hypothyroidism, so that's low functioning of the thyroid, would be fatigue, weakness, weight gain or increased difficulty losing weight, coarse, dry hair, dry, rough, pale skin, puffiness of the face and the hands and the ankles, hair loss and thinning of the head hair, but also the outside third of the eyebrows. You can get red, irritated or dry eyes, cold intolerance, cold body temperature and lack of perspiration, muscle cramps and frequent muscle aches, constipation, depression, irritability, memory loss, abnormal menstrual cycles, and decreased libido. And so the symptoms that are then associated with hyperthyroidism, so overactive thyroid, would be fatigue and muscle weakness, hand tremors, mood swings, nervousness or anxiety, rapid heartbeat, heart palpitations or irregular heartbeat, skin dryness, trouble sleeping, weight loss, although that's not always the case, increased frequency of bowel movements, and then light periods or skipping periods. And as I said before, there are really long lists with both of these. For a lot of the time, people have some of the symptoms. They don't necessarily have all of the symptoms. And one of the problems I see with thyroid issues is that they are pretty poorly diagnosed. And from my perspective, this isn't so much with being difficult to diagnose, but because so few of the markers are regularly tested when someone goes in to say or to see about a thyroid issue. And not only are some of the things not checked, a lot of the ones that are checked, the reference ranges are very wide and can cause a problem. So to help explain this a little better, I want to look at the different hormones that can be linked into the thyroid. And these are hormones that are either produced by the thyroid or affect thyroid hormone production, or are substances that the thyroid then has an effect on, so it can give us an indication of its production. So I'm going to go through all these different hormones. So to start with is TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone. So TSH is actually released by the pituitary gland in the brain. And when TSH is released, it then stimulates the thyroid to produce thyroxine, or T4. So the thyroid and the pituitary work in a negative feedback loop, whereas as TSH increases, T4 production should also increase, and as it then gets to the level that it needs to, TSH will then stop. And so when T4 is low, TSH goes up. When T4 is high, TSH comes down. And so it's in this feedback loop that works. And there is actually a third hormone as part of this loop, which is thyrotrophin releasing hormone, which is actually produced by the hypothalamus. But this is a hormone that's not tested that regularly, and it's for very specific incidents. So I'm not really going to cover it today, but just know that there's actually 3 hormones as part of that feedback loop. So getting back to TSH. TSH is typically the hormone that is checked by your doctor as part of your thyroid screening. And while I'm going to go through a whole host of hormones that are important for thyroid health, it's often just the TSH and possibly T4 that are usually checked by your doctor. And that's at least within the NHS in the UK, but from all reports and from people I work with overseas, similar things in terms of the US and in terms of Australia, etc. And so if TSH is checked and it's in the right range, then normally doctors don't bother checking other thyroid hormones, even if someone has thyroid symptoms. And so often people complain about the fact that they have this long list of symptoms. Those symptoms really match up with thyroid issues, but they were then tested for their thyroid. They were told it was in a normal range, and that was kind of the end of it. And one of the biggest issues with this is that the reference range for TSH is way too wide, in my opinion. And it's not just in my opinion, it's in the opinion of lots of doctors and lots of researchers as well. So the normal reference range for TSH is somewhere between 0.4 and 4.5. It will vary slightly from different countries, but that's the rough reference range. So if you say tested as a 4 on TSH, then you'll be told that you're tested within a normal range and that everything is fine with your thyroid. And the problem is that reference range is much bigger than it should be. So lots of research as well as doctors believe that the upper limit for TSH really should be somewhere around about 2 instead of 4.5. So when TSH is 2 above, this is a fair indicator that things aren't working so well with the thyroid. And at 2, really, this is the cutoff point that I use when I'm looking at test results. But because 4.5 is that usual reference range, lots of people are told that they're fine when really further investigation should be done. So the next hormone is thyroxine, which is also known as T4. So T4 is predominantly created in the thyroid gland, and it's used to help metabolic functions like growth and development, metabolism of fats and protein, regulation of steroid hormones, immune function, increasing basal metabolic rate. But T4's role is predominantly as a pro-hormone, which means that it's a hormone that is then converted into another hormone. And in the case of T4, this is converted into T3. And this is something I'm going to come back to when we go through T3. But for now, just understand that while T4 can have some impact on your metabolic function and a stimulating effect, it's most important more as a raw material so you can then create T3. And this is why I'm always quite surprised when looking at thyroid function that most of the time it's just the TSH and T4 that are being tested. And while TSH and T4 can be helpful, they're really just the tip of the iceberg for understanding what's actually going on. So with testing of T4, you actually have 2 different options. You have T4 and you have free T4. And so the difference is when hormones are in the body, they can be in their active form or they can be in an inactive state. And when hormones are in an inactive state, they are bound to some other substance. So they're floating around within the blood, but they aren't having any impact because they're bound to this substance, and it means that they're inactivated. And it then prevents, because they're bound, it prevents them from having an impact on the body. So the active hormone is then when it is then unbound or when it's free. And this is the hormone that is then able to dock onto a receptor site and to have an impact on functions within the body. And for most hormones, the majority that is circulating within the blood is actually inactive. And for example, with T4, normally there is about 0.03% in the active form, whereas the rest is totally inactive. And while the levels of inactive hormones are useful to know, it's really the active hormones that I think give you much more of a window into what's going on. So when they test for T4, this is looking at all of the T4 that is in the body, both in the active and the inactive form. When the test is for free T4, it's just looking at the active form. And this is really what you want to be looking at it, as it gives you a better guide as to what's really going on. So with the free T4 tests, the reference ranges can vary depending on the lab and the country and the units that it's being measured in. In the UK, the British Thyroid Foundation says that the reference range is between 9 and 25 picomoles per litre. I can't seem to find an official range in the US, but from one of the US labs, it lifted a reference range of 0.7 to 1.53 nanograms per deciliter. So the typical optimal range is for free T4 is from about the midpoint of the reference range to the top, with me preferring people to be about to the top third upwards. So for example, if the reference range for free T4 is between 9 and 25, as it is in the UK, the optimal would be between about 17 and 25, with the real sort of ideal being the top third, so somewhere between about 20 and 27. There are certain nutrients that are needed directly for the creation of T4, and they are iodine and tyrosine. And if clients are showing low amounts of T4, amongst other things, I'll make sure that they're eating foods with decent amounts of these nutrients in them. And if they're not eating foods with decent amounts of iodine and tyrosine, I'll get them to be actively increasing this. So foods that are high in iodine are sea vegetables, so things like kelp, nori, kombu, wakame, then actual fish like haddock, whiting, cod, scallops, clams, sardines, salmon, eggs, butter, cheddar cheese, milk, yogurt, pineapple, and sea salt. And then foods that are high in tyrosine, so cheeses, particularly things like Parmesan, Gruyere, Edam, and cottage cheese, beef, turkey, lamb, game meat, white and oily fish, prawns, crab, butterbean, bananas, spirulina, tempeh, natto, and then rice. So tyrosine is an amino acid, so it's high in lots of protein-rich foods, but not all protein-rich foods have the same amounts of tyrosine in it. So those are the ones that are your best bets. But as I mentioned earlier on, T4's main role is predominantly as a pro-hormone. So T4 is then converted into T3. And some of T4 is converted into T3 in the thyroid, but most of it is converted in other tissues. So this is predominantly done in the liver or in the kidneys. So T3 is the more metabolically stimulating form of thyroid hormone. T3 is a thyroid hormone that has the most impact on cellular metabolism and stoking the fire, so everything works well in the body. So when I listed those different functions at the beginning that are controlled by thyroid, this is predominantly the work of T3. And T3 is really the hormone that runs the show with thyroid in terms of stimulating metabolism. So despite T3's importance in health, it's surprisingly common how often it's not checked when diagnosing or trying to diagnose a thyroid issue. And I've had clients who are on thyroid medication, and when they're checked by their doctors on the NHS, it's a real fight to get T3 tested, even though they've got hypothyroidism. And a majority of time, all they're getting tested is TSH and T4. And this really baffles me, but that's what typically happens. So with testing of T3, just like with T4, there are the two tests. So you have one for plain old T3, which looks at all of the active and the inactive, and then you have the free T3, which is just looking at the active form of T3. And free T3 is my preference with these tests to see how much is actually active in the body. And look, don't get me wrong, testing just T4 and T3 is useful because it lets you know how much of this hormone is actually being created in total within the body, and seeing how much of this T4 is then converted into T3, and that's really useful to know. But in terms of gauging how much is active within the body and having an impact, free T3 is best for this. So the reference ranges for free T3 in the UK is roughly between 3.5 and 6.5 picomoles per litre, and in the US it's 2.3 to 4.2 picograms per milliliter. The optimal ranges for T3 is about the halfway point and upwards, which is kind of similar to T4. So in the UK, if the reference range is between 3.5 and 6.5, ideally I'm wanting to see someone from about 5 to 6.5. So to make the conversion from T4 to T3, there are actually 4 key nutrients that are needed. There's selenium, zinc, iron, and copper. And like I mentioned with T4, if someone is low in free T3 or T3, I'll check to see that they are eating foods that contain these nutrients. And if they're not eating them enough, then I'll get them to increase it. So let's look at some of the foods that contain them. So for selenium, you have kelp, oysters, herring, mussels, mustard seeds, shiitake mushrooms, lobster, turkey breast, chicken breast, wheat germ, wheat bran, whole wheat, rye, brewer's yeast. For zinc, you have oysters, clams, prawns, whitefish, red meat and organ meats, eggs, whole grains, brewer's yeast, and ginger. For iron, you have liver, beef, eggs, spirulina, prune juice, brewer's yeast, rice bran, molasses. For copper, you have things like oysters, crab, eggs, lobster, brewer's yeast, olives, wheat bran. I'm not covering all the foods here. Like, you can definitely easily do a Google search on foods that are high in selenium or copper or any of that kind of thing to bring up a much more detailed list. But what this should hopefully, if you kind of listen to the foods that keep coming up more and again, they're typically foods that are decent in protein. A lot of the stuff that comes from the sea is very helpful for this stuff. And so it's why I often recommend those kinds of foods with people. So the next hormone that is then worth testing is called reverse T3. And as I mentioned before, T4 is converted into T3, but actually some of the T4 is also converted into a substance called reverse T3. And this is a substance that we all make. It's not just those that suffer with thyroid issues that make it. But what happens with people with thyroid issues is that reverse T3 can be in much higher quantities. And when I say people with thyroid issues with reverse T3, here I'm referring much more to people who have hypothyroid issues, so underactive thyroid issues. So what is reverse T3? It's a hormone that is very similar to T3, but in fact it has no activating function. So while T3 will enter a receptor and create some kind of change like increasing energy production or increasing hormone production or that kind of thing, with reverse T3, it will still enter and dock onto the receptor site, but it causes no action. So it doesn't stimulate any change within the body. And as I mentioned, T3 is the most actively metabolically stimulating hormone of the thyroid hormones, and its role is to stimulate. So if someone is then producing much higher amounts of reverse T3, then they're not going to get the benefits of that stimulation, and things aren't going to work so well, and they're much more likely to be then getting symptoms. So cortisol, either being too high or being too low, tends to lead to more conversion of T4 to reverse T3 instead of T4 to T3. And when the nutrients that are needed for T4 to T3 conversion are low, so that's nutrients selenium, zinc, copper, and iron, then reverse T3 production is also much more likely. For the test results as I said, you can get reverse T3 tested. What you'll often want to look at is the ratio between free T3 and reverse T3. And with this, if you divide the free T3 by reverse T3, you want a ratio of 20 or higher. And to get the lab results to work, you've got to have these in the same measurements before you're doing then the converting. So make sure that they're in the same units when you're converting. But once you've converted them into the same units, you can then do the calculation. And ideally, you want to be seeing 20 or above. If it's below this, then it's an indication the body's producing higher amounts of reverse T3, and this could be creating the problem. So the next thing that's worth looking at is thyroid antibodies. And these are autoimmune substances. And what autoimmune means is that it's a substance or an immune substance within the body that starts to attack healthy tissues in the body. And in this case, it's healthy tissue that it's attacking is the thyroid gland. So just like someone who has type 1 diabetes, where the body creates autoimmune substances that attack the beta cells within the pancreas and you can't produce insulin, you have substances that can then attack the thyroid gland and preventing its ability to create T4 and to function properly. So there are actually 3 different antibodies that can be tested. So the first is thyroid peroxidase antibody, also known as TPO. The next is thyroglobulin antibody, shortened to TG. And then the final one is thyroid stimulating hormone receptor antibody, which is shortened to TRA. So TPO is the most common of these that is tested as part of thyroid issues, but it's worth doing a couple of them depending on what the situation is. And I'm going to go into this in more detail when we look at the different types of thyroid issues. And so rather than testing just TPO, it's worth doing TPO and TG or TPO and TRA. And it's actually normal for people to have some of these antibodies generally within their system. Just having some of these antibodies in your system doesn't mean that you've got an issue with your thyroid and an autoimmune issue with your thyroid. But it's when they're in the higher up level of the reference range or even outside the reference range because it's so high that it's then starting to be a problem. But normally with them, you're wanting to look at 2 different types of the autoimmune antibodies, not just the one. And as I said, I'll cover this in a little bit when we look at the different types of thyroid issues. So the next test that I think is worthwhile is actually testing for cholesterol. And I know that cholesterol is normally thought about as something associated with heart disease, but it's also really important as part of thyroid diagnosis. And interestingly, Broder Barnes, who is basically the godfather of thyroid treatment, wrote a book called Solved the Riddle of Heart Attacks. And he looked as part of that book at the link between poor thyroid function and cardiovascular disease. So the reason why cholesterol can be useful in helping to diagnose thyroid issues is to do with cholesterol's importance in hormone production. So all of your steroid hormones in your body use cholesterol as the raw material in which they're produced from. So the body starts out with cholesterol that's then converted into a hormone called pregnenolone. And pregnenolone is a hormone on its own, but it's also a pro-hormone, just like T4. And pregnenolone is then converted into the rest of your steroid hormones. So hormones like DHEA, cortisone, progesterone, aldosterone, etc. To make the conversion from cholesterol to pregnenolone, you need a number of different substances. And one of the substances is T3. So if the body is low in T3, then it's difficult to make this conversion, and cholesterol will then start to stay quite high. And this is particularly the LDL cholesterol. So a high cholesterol reading, along with other indicators, can point towards thyroid function that's not working properly. Equally, having really low cholesterol along with other factors or other indicators could point towards the overactive thyroid and the fact that the body is churning over much more of that cholesterol and turning it into other hormones. So the final test that can be worth doing is looking at iron. And iron is incredibly important for the conversion of T4 to T3. Also, good stomach acid is required for the digestion and absorption of iron. And because thyroid issues can interfere with digestion and create lower stomach acid, low iron can be common in hypothyroidism. When checking iron, there are actually 4 different things that want to be checked as part of it. So it's ferritin, serum iron, TIBC, which stands for total iron binding capacity, and then percentage of transferrin saturation. And so looking at these different numbers, and some will be high or low depending on the different patterns of things, can then be really helpful to determine what someone's iron status is. So if thyroid issues are suspected and all of these different tests are then performed, you or your practitioner is then going to have lots of information to then make an assessment on. And I'm not a doctor, so I can't make any assessment I can't make a diagnosis for a client, but I can look at the numbers and I can explain what numbers mean in the different points and what those numbers can point towards, and say that maybe you should be then seeing a doctor to get this further investigated. One further test that is helpful that you can do at home is body temperature. And this was popularized by Broder Barnes, who I mentioned earlier on. To do this test, you want to take your temperature first thing in the morning on waking before getting out of bed. So this is before you've got up, before you've done any movement. Just you wake up, you pull a thermometer that you've got on your bedside table, and then you put it under your arm or you put it in your mouth. And ideally, the human body should be between 36.7 and 37 degrees, or 98 to 98.6 Fahrenheit. If you test and you're lower than this point, it can point towards an underactive thyroid. The likelihood of this goes up with the lower the temperature, and then the more symptoms that someone has associated with a thyroid condition. And the reason why low body temperature is connected to thyroid issues is all to do with energy production. So when your cells produce energy, which is known as ATP or cellular energy, as part of that process, they also produce heat as well as carbon dioxide at the same time. So T3 allows proper energy production within the cell. So if T3 is lower or thyroid's not working so well, then energy production at the cell level goes down, and this means that heat production also goes down, and hence the body is going to be colder. So if the body is constantly cooler, then it's an indication that energy production is not working so well, and this can point towards something going on with the thyroid. Equally, if body temperature is constantly elevated above 37 degrees Celsius or 98.6 Fahrenheit, then this could point towards hyperthyroidism or overactive thyroid. I would say that there are lots of reasons for an increased body temperature outside of thyroid issues. So things like inflammation or infection or reproductive hormone issues. So it would be worth looking at what are the different symptoms alongside this higher temperature to start to piece together, is this something that's going on? So there are a number of different thyroid issues. Obviously, I've mentioned hyperthyroid and hypothyroid, but even within each of these different categories, there are different types depending on what the different lab results show. And I'm not going to cover every different alternative for what could be going wrong with the thyroid, but I want to go through the different main types of conditions and explain a little bit more. So the first issue is known as overt hypothyroidism. So this is an overt case of an underactive thyroid. And to be given this diagnosis, this is when your TSH is elevated and your T4 is decreased. So in the UK, this would be a TSH that's above 5 and a T4 that's below 50. And in fact, it's often not until TSH reaches about 10 before medication is often prescribed. So someone can have a TSH of 7 or 8 and they're told to just wait and see what happens. And realistically, things have got to be fairly along the road and fairly well progressed for someone to be getting these readings. So pathologically, things have moved along quite a while for someone to be getting readings where there's this real obvious overt thyroid issue. So the next type of hypothyroidism is known as subclinical hypothyroidism. And this is where TSH is above the reference range, but T4 is still within range. And the thinking here is that while TSH is high, it's not having much of an impact on T4 because it's still within the range. And in these cases, again, it's often that the person isn't prescribed anything, but is told to wait and see. If TSH reaches 10 while T4 is still within range, medication is normally prescribed. But prior to this amount, not much happens, and it's normally just a wait and see game. And as I said earlier, the ideal of TSH is really 2 or below. So you have to wait for a reading of 10 or even a reading of 5. This means that things are much further on than they really should be. And also because T3 or reverse T3 are rarely checked, it's hard to really tell how much things are out or how well things are really working. And it's for this reason that so many people are told that there's nothing wrong and that everything's working well with their thyroid, despite the fact that they're plagued with a long list of symptoms that are associated with thyroid issues. And it's not until someone has got into a really bad state before the diagnosis is often made. So the next type of thyroid issue is called Hashimoto's disease. And this was first discovered by a Japanese specialist called Hakuru Hashimoto in 1912. And Hashimoto's is a type of hypothyroidism, so underactive thyroid, where it's being caused by an autoimmune problem. So immune cells are attacking the thyroid. So in this situation, typically TSH will be elevated and T4 will be decreased. And if they test T3, often as time's gone on, it will also be decreased. There are times when all 3 of these numbers are still well within the range, well, at least within the wide ranges that are used as part of thyroid hormones, not necessarily the ideal range that I've mentioned earlier. But to be diagnosed with Hashimoto's, the person will need to test positive for TPO and TG, which are the antibody tests that I mentioned. So if these are elevated, then a diagnosis of Hashimoto's is often given. And with Hashimoto's disease, the actual thyroid can go in 2 directions. So sometimes it can grow in size and become a mass of real fibrous tissues, but where the glands that actually produce the T4 are actually disappearing. And this can then lead to a goiter and can be felt during an examination by a doctor. But it can also go in the other direction with the thyroid actually shrinking. And this is actually the more common form of Hashimoto's, the more common thing of what happens. And because the antibodies then block the TSH receptors in the thyroid, on this basis, if the thyroid is not using it, it loses it, and then the glandular tissue then begins to shrink. So what I just want to get across is, while it's often common to refer to all hypothyroid issues as Hashimoto's, the name really should be reserved for those with antibodies that have been detected, or at least where it's coming from an autoimmune issue. So the next type of thyroid problem is hyperthyroidism. And just like with hypothyroidism, there's both the overt, and then the subclinical form. So for overt hyperthyroidism, this is where TSH is below the reference range, while T4 is well above the reference range. And then in subclinical hyperthyroidism, you'll have a low or suppressed TSH, but T4 will still be in the normal reference range. And then the next condition is called Graves' disease. So Graves' disease is similar to Hashimoto's disease in that it's an autoimmune disease, but rather than causing hypothyroidism, it causes hyperthyroidism. So test-wise, you'll normally have TSH, which will be low. You'll have T4, which is going to be elevated. And then the autoimmune antibodies, so TPO and then TRA, you'll get these tests run. And with Graves' disease, you'll have either or both of these that can be elevated. But it's really the TRA that's very conclusive in terms of diagnosing Graves' disease. So I want to cover some bits and pieces about medication and treatment. And as I mentioned earlier, I am not a doctor. I don't want to tell, and I don't tell people to go on or come off medication. That's not my job. If you are on medication and you're listening to this and what I say as part of this section appeals to you, then speak to your doctor about it. I don't want you doing anything that I say to be misconstrued as recommendations about what people should be doing with their medication, because that's definitely not what I'm saying here. With hyperthyroidism, the normal prescription is a synthetic form of T4. And the dose is normally started off fairly small and slowly increased. And while this increase is going on, TSH and T4 is typically being tested. And the medication is increased until the TSH and the T4 come back into their reference ranges. And once this happens, then the dosage is normally then leveled out at that amount. And that is then the dosage that's kept up, with hormones being tested periodically, whether that be once a year or however often the doctor recommends. And in some people, this can really help, and they see improvements in their symptoms. And if this is the case, then that's great, and it's really good that is helping them. Unfortunately, for others, things improve a little bit, but a lot of the symptoms remain. And this, from my perspective, can happen for a number of reasons. And the first is that despite increasing the amount of T4, the body's not actually converting it into T3 very well. And as I mentioned earlier, T3 is the more active form of thyroid hormone, and T4 would be thought about more as a pro-hormone. And so if this conversion isn't happening, then things aren't going to be working so well, because at that cell level where you're really needing that stimulation, there isn't that T3 to do that, and so symptoms are staying around. So in these situations or instances, sometimes the person is offered a synthetic form of T3 alongside their T4. And then now, in this instance, they're getting the more active form of thyroid hormone, and this can then really help to abate their symptoms. Unfortunately, T3 supplementation doesn't happen very often. So there's lots of people who are on high doses of T4, they're feeling poorly, but they're told that their numbers are in the right range and that there's nothing more that the doctor can do. And T3 has a much shorter half-life within the body than T4 does. So if you are someone who is then recommended to take T3 alongside T4, you normally need to be taking more doses of it than the T4. So some doctors will recommend that you cut the pills up into 3 or 4 pieces, and that these pieces are then taken at intervals throughout the day, rather than just taking one tablet once a day. And as I mentioned at the start of this section, I'm not a doctor, so I'm not saying that that's what you should be doing. But if you are taking T3, it might, and you're taking it just as one dose, it might be worth chatting to your doctor about the fact that it could be helpful to break up it into smaller pieces and to try it out and see what happens. The other reason that some people see little improvements in their symptoms when taking medication, this can be taking either T4 or T3, is because they're not eating enough. And one of the common symptoms of hypothyroidism is a tendency to put on weight. And we have a real pathological relationship with weight and dieting these days. And as someone starts to notice that they're putting on more weight, the knee-jerk reaction is to eat less and less. And lots of people then get to the stage where they're surviving off very little, and that this very little amount of eating becomes the new norm. And it's often at some point that they are then diagnosed with an underactive thyroid, and they're then put on medication. But regularly, this small amount of eating then continues, even though they're now taking that medication, and it continues onwards. And with thyroid hormones, their role is to stimulate cells to produce energy, or that's one of their roles. And this is to then increase your metabolic rate so that the cells can then be producing more of that ATP. But if someone's barely eating anything, then there's not really available energy to increase the output with. And because people are then terrified to increase their food intake, that energy shortage continues on. So despite the fact that someone is now having more T4 enter into the body then still continues to go at a slower rate because there isn't the raw materials to then increase things. And again, this can even happen with someone's taking T3 if they keep their eating at a level that doesn't match up with what their body really needs to be using. And for me, this is where actually a lot of thyroid problems come from. If someone isn't eating enough, your body has to turn down its functions. And we evolved over a time when food shortages were a real thing. And the best way to keep you alive in these times was to slow down your metabolism. And it did this by reducing thyroid hormones. And as food would then become plentiful again and people would eat more, thyroid hormones again would start to increase. The body would realize that the famine was over, and so they could increase the metabolism to match up with the higher amount of food that's now coming in. And so people are creating the same situation today as being in a famine. Despite the abundance of food that is around us at every corner, people are living and eating and exercising in a way that really says to their body, we are in a famine. And when this happens, adding in extra T4 or even adding in extra T3 isn't going to repair the problem, because all this is going to do is encourage the body to get through more of its limited resources quicker. And the body's going to really want to fight against this because its goal is to keep you alive. So eating enough is super important for dealing with thyroid issues. Quality is definitely important, and especially the foods that I covered earlier on that provide the various nutrients needed to create T4 and to create T3. But quantity is equally important, because you can be eating lots of different foods that are rich in selenium or zinc or tyrosine. But if you're under-eating for your body's needs, it's going to resist using these nutrients to create more of the thyroid hormones because it really wants to protect you. And it wants to protect you by keeping that metabolism lower because there's not enough coming in to increase that metabolism. So that is it for this week. I hope this gives you a better understanding of thyroid issues and some useful advice if it's something you're going through or you suspect is a problem for you. As I said at the start of the show, I'm now back to doing this every week after a couple of weeks off. So I'm going to be back next week with another episode with a guest. So have an awesome week, and I will catch you then.
Thanks for listening to Real Health Radio. If you are interested in more details, you can find them at the 7 Health website. That's www.7, pro-health.com.